A very good evening to everyone. On behalf of the Center for Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development at Impact and Policy Research Institute, Terry School of Advanced Studies, and the India Water Portal, I extend my warm welcome to episode 7 of the State of the Environment, #Planet Talk, Simi Mehta. We are all aware of the challenges posed by climatic changes, extreme weather events, and environmental degradation, and their impact on almost all aspects of human life, ranging from food, nutrition, shelter, livelihoods, as well as all sectors of the economy, society, and nation, both in India and across the world. Scholars and climate scientists, policymakers, and the civil society have put forth several recommendations and strategies to mitigate the challenges and adapt to the changing circumstances on the one hand, and simultaneously explore sustainable ways to develop. Low carbon development policy, which is also inclusive in nature, has been considered as a novel approach that would account for human well-being indicators. One another advantage that is that this is consistent with some of the goals of the Agenda 2030. But how does India do it? Are India's NDCs attaining any rewards? Should we not hold the bigger polluters like the US, China accountable? To reflect on these and other pertinent issues on the topic, towards sustainable low carbon and equitable development pathways in India, we have with us Dr. D. Raghunandan, who leads the environment and climate change campaign of the All India People Science Network. He has closely studied the environmental and related industrial policy issues in the international and domestic scenarios for over 4 decades as part of the Delhi Science Forum. He has published widely, both in India and abroad, on the international climate change negotiations, on India's role and position in these negotiations, as well as on India's domestic climate and environmental policies. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us this evening. And now I invite you to make your presentation.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. Over to you.
Good evening to all.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Is my screen visible now, Simi?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So good evening, all. My presentation today is about how we can get to low carbon and equitable development pathways in India. I am emphasizing equitable because quite often in discussions on this subject, we only look at low carbon pathways. We look at how to reduce carbon, but we neglect the area of equity, particularly with regard to access to energy, which I think is crucial for this, because I think in the long term, there can be no environmental justice without social justice. So I'd like to put this point across through this presentation and look at how we can get to such low carbon equitable development pathways in India. Hello, my slideshow is not working. My slideshow is not working, sorry.
You can just try again.
Not able to move the screen. Okay. Yeah, I'm back on screen now. Thanks.
Yes, yes.
I'll briefly outline my presentation and what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'll very briefly look at the context, which is the Paris Agreement, which to my mind represents a deep inequity between nations, as Dr. Simi was mentioning in her introduction. And in that context, to look at India's NDCs, her nationally determined contributions. And then look at limitations of India's NDCs in terms of what it covers and what it does not cover. Specifically, I'd like to look at the important issue of inequity within our country in terms of our climate policies, environmental policies, and developmental frameworks. And in that context, I will frame the need for what I am terming as cross-sectoral and multiple benefits perspective, a perspective that does not look at just each sector by sector in silos, but looks at cross-sectoral linkages and looks at multiple benefits in aiming at either mitigation or adaptation programs, which then leads me to sketch out the low carbon equitable development pathway through examples from some major sectors. So the Paris Agreement, while broadly welcomed for the fact that at least some agreement is finally on the table, is clearly deeply flawed. It is inadequate for the target of 2 degrees Celsius. In fact, if you sum all the NDCs of all the countries, it's estimated that it will reach about 3.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. The voluntary pledges by all nations fall short of the requirement by about 15 billion tons or 15 gigatons of carbon dioxide. It delays action till beyond 2020. And now this will shift to 2023 after the global stocktake. And it is deeply inequitable. If you look at all the NDCs put together, you will find that the industrialized countries have cut emissions by only 2.3 gigatons, while developing countries put together, including India, have cut by 5.1 gigatons. So the burden, the bulk of the burden of the emission cuts are being borne by the developing countries. And this is partly built into the structure or the architecture of the Paris Agreement itself. The agreement perpetuates what I call the occupation of the atmospheric commons by the industrialized countries. Today, the carbon stock that we have today in the atmosphere, about 75% of the blanket of carbon dioxide surrounding the Earth has been put there by the developed countries, by the industrialized countries. Nothing we can do about that now. And what the Paris Agreement does is to say, well, forget about that. Let's only talk about what's going forward. That's called a forward-looking perspective. So there's no talk of historical emissions. This 75% of carbon dioxide, which is already put in, is ignored. And an analogy which I often give in this is, in a forward-looking perspective, the industrialized countries are virtually telling the developing countries, look, forget about what happened before. There is limited carbon space available. Let developing and developed countries share this equally. That is, there's one guy who has got fat by eating most of the food. And he says, well, now look, we are facing a crisis. There's very little food left. So let's be fair. Out of the remaining food, I will eat half of what I was doing. You also eat half of what I'm doing. That's fair because this is going forward. The problem with this is that the fat man will end up looking nice and trim and the thin man will die. And this is what is happening because of the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, India has also played into this target. First, of course, at Copenhagen, we took an enlightened position, which was pushed for by many of us in civil society in India, which is to tell the world that even though India is not part of this problem historically, we want to be a part of the solution. We are a large developing country with growing capabilities. And we would like to contribute to this global effort. And at Copenhagen, India moved away from its earlier do-nothing position to saying we will take some measures to reduce emissions also. But it also went along with most of the positions which were pushed by the United States, driven by Indian desire to forge a closer Indo-US strategic partnership. But in that process, we also lost all our traditional allies in the least developed countries, in the small island states, and we landed up in the position which you can see in the photograph below at Durban. You can see our then Environment Minister Jayanti Natarajan surrounded by everybody, because India held up the final declaration on the outcome on the point that we will not accept binding commitments. Now, the point is, if any commitment is made, it has to be binding. But India held up for some unknown reason, because suddenly there was a move within India to move back to the earlier negotiating stance. And then India found herself surrounded by the developed countries. You can see the US representative here, by the developing countries. And that's the representative of Grenada there, representing the island states, who told India, what are you saying? Are you saying you will develop while we die? Don't you think this is an important issue to which everybody must contribute? And then India, of course, went along with the consensus by doing some literary jugglery with the language, but the net impact is the same. Most unfortunately, however, I think the point is, in the international negotiations, India looked at this basically as a foreign policy, international relations exercise, and forgot that India, like the island states and like the least developed countries, actually should have been arguing for higher ambition, pushing the developed countries to take on more responsibility, because India's vital interests were at stake, because the impacts of climate change on India were as serious as the impact on most of the island states and the least developed countries. And this aspect, I think, has been ignored, and also reflects in the Indian domestic climate policy. Now, if I just look at the key impacts, the fifth assessment report said South Asia was among the 10 worst affected regions of the world. We have a huge coastline, over 6,000 kilometers, most vulnerable to sea level rise. If you see the last photograph at the bottom, you will see India and China above it as among the most impacted regions from sea level rise. Even at 2 degrees Celsius, forget about whether if it goes to 3, 3.5, etc. A major impact is going to be felt on agriculture, which we are likely to see a close to 20% drop in output at a 2.5 degrees temperature rise scenario, and maybe even going up to 30 to 40% drop if we reach 3.5 degrees Celsius. And these are figures given by India's own official submission to the UNFCCC, which is called the National Communication, the NATCOM2, as well as in the National Mission on Sustainable Agriculture. The photograph on top shows you a comparison of the food production position now, and the bottom photograph compared to 2050, and you will see two countries or regions most badly affected, shown in dark brown, which is Mexico and in India. They're also seeing more heat wave days, more heavy rainfall days, more shift in monsoons, all of which we have just recently witnessed even in this year itself. The middle photograph shows you the retreat of the Gangotri glacier, and this will affect the water flow into the Ganga-Jamna basin, which directly impacts on the lives of close to 700 million people downstream. So India's climate policy should be driven by these vital national interests. We need the world to take on ambitious climate targets. we need to ensure that the world moves to 2 degrees Celsius targets. This voluntary target accepting, which is in the Paris Agreement, is a highly flawed system. Nowadays, the IPL is going on in the UAE and Sharjah and India. Well, we are all cricket fans one way or the other. So let me give you a cricket analogy of this. The voluntary targets in the Paris Agreement are akin to, if you see a limited over game like is going on now, the team that bats first in a 2020 match, let's say, scores 150. And the team that comes second has a team meeting. The guy who opens the batting says, well, I'll volunteer to score 20. The runner says, I'll volunteer to score 20. The third guy says, I'll volunteer to score 15. Everybody volunteers and goes off very happily, clapping their hands, but nobody has sat down and totaled this up to see whether this is coming to 150 to beat the side or not. And this is what the Paris Agreement is like. Everybody has made voluntary contributions, but the totals don't add up to what is required. So it's a very foolish way of going about things, but that's what the whole world has agreed under pressure of the industrialized countries. Now, in that context, let's look at India's NDC, which takes 2030 as a target. There are 3 main pledges, quantitative pledges in India's NDC. The headline pledge is that India will reduce its emissions intensity. Emissions intensity means the ratio of emissions to GDP. It's emissions divided by GDP. So India would reduce its emissions intensity by 33 to 35% by the year 2030 with respect to a baseline year of 2005. Now, if you look at this, this is mostly an extension of the pledge made earlier at Copenhagen and Durban, where India said we will reduce emissions intensity by 20 to 25% by 2020. So the same thing by extension, we have taken it to 2030. Now, it's important to recognize that if you look at global figures, emissions intensity on an average reduces by about 1% per annum in developed countries. But in India, since we made the pledge at Copenhagen, we have registered a 2.5% decline per year since 2005. At that rate, reaching this target of 33 to 35% by 2030 is going to be quite easy. So we have actually made a pledge which is not that difficult to achieve. However, as I will explain later, I am not badly judging India's target with this, because the targets given by industrialized countries, developed countries, is even worse. So in a general situation where everybody is scoring 20, India has managed to score 25. So it's not too bad, but a score of 25 is not going great and is not going to win us the match. The other major pledge which India has made is that we will increase forest/tree cover to 33%. I'll come to this in a little detail later, because there are many niceties involved in this. And as a major means of implementation of reducing emissions intensity, we have pledged to increase the proportion of renewable energy in installed power generation capacity to 40%. 40% renewable energy by 2030. But you know, simultaneously, the present government had made a pledge to raise the solar commitment and renewable commitments to 175 gigawatts of renewable energy. That's 100 gigawatts. A gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. So 1 lakh megawatts of solar, then 60,000 megawatts of wind, then hydro, and 63 gigawatts of nuclear, and 10 megawatts of all kinds of biomass-based energy. In fact, India, before we made the Paris Pledge, had already committed to this and said we will achieve this by 2022. But in Paris, in our NDCs, we have said this is our target till 2030. Some other sectors are mentioned also, but there are few quantitative targets. So If I make a brief, quick assessment of India's NDCs, Climate Tracker website, very influential website, has rated India's NDC as among a few nations, only a few nations which are compatible with the 2 degrees Celsius target. So from that point of view, India deserves to be congratulated, especially compared to the miserable targets given by the developed countries. However, it is also a moderate target. It's not a very high ambition target, but in contrast, it shows the low ambition of the industrialized countries. In fact, our emissions intensity reduction target will most probably be achieved by the year 2025, even though this 1 year economic disruption due to COVID may set this back by a year or two. Renewable energy installed capacity is already 36%, and our target is 40% by 2030. So it is easy to see that this is not going to be difficult to achieve either. Therefore, my argument is there is scope for higher ambition on India, but we should not make any unilateral commitment on this, because unlike what we did at Copenhagen, which is what we wanted the government to do, we should use a possible Indian higher ambition target as leverage in order to extract higher ambition by the ICs. For example, if the European Union has committed 20% emission cuts by 2030, we should say, you give us 30% emission cuts by 2030, then we will give you higher commitment. So it should be a if and but or a conditional commitment, if you like, in order to extract higher, deeper cuts by the industrialized countries. To my mind, however, and this is crucial to our discussions today, what is very disappointing is in the NDCs that there's a virtual absence of adaptation and resilience measures on climate impacts. Now, we may look at this and say, well, you know, the NDCs were meant for the Paris Agreement. It is aimed at the target of emission reduction, so we were only concerned with mitigation, etc. But the absence of any serious discussion on adaptation in the NDCs, after all, there is no other policy document that we have for domestic climate policy. NDCs is the policy document, in which case it should have contained our what we are going to do for adaptation, to which I'll come during the course of the discussion, but this is virtually absent in the NDC. The NDC also does not discuss many other important sectors or issues, even in mitigation. To me, the most disappointing aspect is that there is a total neglect of domestic equity in the NDCs whatsoever. It's as if there's no problem, you know, everybody is the same in India, per capita Indian, and we'll just go ahead. There is no problem in differential energy consumption and therefore responsibility for emissions within Indian society. Therefore, because of all these, the NDCs to me is a major and serious lost opportunity to aim at sketching out as a domestic policy document an alternative low carbon and equitable development pathways, which is what this talk is about. So just to emphasize this point about international and domestic inequality, we know that our India's position in the global negotiations right from the beginning has been correctly focused on the inequality between nations. And if you see the bar chart on the left, it shows energy use per capita. You can see the USA way up there and India way down at the bottom, even below global average. And in fact, even by 2030, even with high emissions and high growth rates in India, our emissions will still be, and energy use, per capita energy use and per capita emissions will still be below global average. On the average American, if you like, consumes about 17 times the energy as the average Indian. Therefore, roughly speaking, the average American is responsible for 17 times the emissions of the average Indian. But who is this average Indian? Is it us who are watching this program, or is it also our brothers living in rural Bihar or UP, or our tribal sisters living in in Chhattisgarh and in the Northeast, etc.? No electricity in the house, no car, no scooter, no vehicle. So no consumption of energy by some. There are very few estimates of this. There is one which I have cited here, which is from the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Studies, which shows that roughly speaking, the average urban Indian perhaps consumes about 10 times as much energy as the average rural Indian. So let's be clear, there is very deep inequity in terms of energy consumption within India as well. So why are we not taking into account, like what we tell the world as a whole, that look, developed countries must reduce their emissions so that developing countries can increase their emissions till both of us come to roughly a par. Similarly, within our country, should we not be taking measures so that the richer, urban, more powerful segments of our population and economy consume less energy, so that those who have less energy access gradually gain a bigger share until there is more equity in energy consumption? Can we design climate policies in such a way? That is the challenge before us, about which I want to talk to you today. So what's my perspective towards a low carbon equitable development pathway? India's NDC, as I said, considers only mitigation as an objective. Solar power, we will achieve this. Forest, we will achieve 33%, so much mitigation. It doesn't look at any other aspect of these policies. For example, in solar power, if we are going to achieve that, are there environmental impacts also? Where is the land going to come from? What impact will that have? Etc., etc. So most policy options actually have multiple impacts, not only on mitigation, but also on equity, on the local environment, like air pollution. In Delhi, what we are facing now, the air pollution has both a climate aspect as well as a local environment aspect, as well as an impact on public health. And also, any policy option will have inevitably impacts on jobs and the economy. Policy choices, therefore, should be based on optimizing these multiple benefits. Of course, I recognize that truly alternative development pathways will call for fundamental social transformation, which is a long-term project. So I am not frankly addressing that today. But what we can address, I think, is in the framework of the NDCs 2030, etc., is to look at intermediate policy measures with multiple benefits for low carbon, environmentally sustainable, socially and economically just development pathways. And I'd like to cite a few examples which maybe could be incorporated in a revised NDC. So I'd like to be looking at these sectors listed here. In terms of mitigation, looking at power generation, energy use and efficiency, transport, buildings, municipal solid and liquid waste, forestry and land use, agriculture, and finally looking at adaptation and climate resilience as well. So if I look at electricity generation, it looked as if India was marching very rapidly towards our goal of 100 gigawatts, but this is slowly facing headwinds with a drop in investment, particularly foreign investment, which India was expecting in power. And in wind power, we are still far away from our target of 75 gigawatts. And remember, this is only installed capacity. Power generation is roughly half of that. So given this scenario, coal will continue to represent about 72% of power generation in our country, at least till 2040, estimated by most experts. Now we need to reduce this because coal leads to land, water, and air pollution in terms of mining, as well as in terms of its combustion in power plants, steel plants, whatever. It has serious impact on forests and rural habitat because a large number of these mining projects are located inside forests. And in areas where it is mined or it is burnt, there are severe health impacts as well in the local population. So solar really needs an even bigger push than it has received so far. And maybe India should be looking more at rooftop installations, at decentralized off-grid systems. But two aspects I would like to emphasize on. One is domestic manufacture. India today is importing roughly 80 to 90% of all solar panels, whether they are in the form of the cells or panels integrated, etc. There's hardly any domestic manufacture. So the jobs that are created in solar are only assembly jobs, which are low-skilled, low-paying jobs. However, with expanded applications, there would be more jobs, more incomes. But if we could step up our domestic manufacture in this country, then it would make a quantum jump in terms of our jobs as well as in terms of our self-reliant capability. Also, once we cross a certain threshold of solar, we will have to look at storage, whether it is battery storage which for decentralized systems or pumped storage for larger systems, on which we need to do R&D, manufacture of these systems, neither of which India has so far made any significant progress in. We need to do this. So in electricity generation, as we have seen, there are other aspects also besides just the mitigation part. The equity requirement is very sharp because the rural scenario in terms of rural electrification is very poor. We declare a village electrified when a lamppost in the village receives electricity. We are not bothered whether the household has received it or not. And when it does, how much electricity does it get? If it gets one bulb lighting for 1 hour in a day, that's not enough. So we need to step up on that. And remember, all the planning for power generation in India is based on a comparison of the let's say, climate change context of looking at energy consumption patterns in countries. And our target has been 4,500 kilowatt hour per head per year, which is supposed to be the threshold for middle income countries. I think it's time to ask the question, is this really required? Or can we plan for a reconfigured energy consumption pattern in which we can achieve the same level of development, but with lower energy consumption, which is the global drive now. And then there is a need to also talk about use of power and demand. So in energy efficiency measures, we have got our energy efficiency star rating systems, but we need to push super efficient appliances, including fans with DC motors, pumps, DG sets, etc. We need tighter energy consumption patterns. We need energy conservation systems. We can perhaps, I'm throwing this number, but we can perhaps think in terms of a long-term planning towards a 2,500 kilowatt hour per head per capita target at 2050 as part of our vision for a low carbon equitable pathway. I then come to transport. In transport, we have got an extremely poor policy formulation at present. I think not more than 7 of our major state capitals have any public transport system to talk about. And that's just state capitals. You can imagine what it is like in tier 2 and tier 3 towns and cities. We also do not have a integrated long-term transport policy as a whole. We need to have a major shift from personal vehicles to mass public transit, such as the push for buses. Now, these green buses were introduced under the Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, which is way back in 2004. There's been no major push on public transport since then. We have neglected the BRT options. We have neglected urban tramways or rail line-based car systems, which you'll see all over Europe, especially in smaller cities. NDCs have also highly underplayed the intermodal shift from rail to road that has taken place since independence. At the time of independence, railways were carrying about 80% of passengers and freight, and road only 20%. Today, the ratio is reverse. It's 80% by road and 20% by rail. This needs to be revised. Our NDCs only talk about 43%. We need to move much faster to maybe 30 to 70% and carry more passengers by train, and introduce more high-speed, medium speed rail, as well as the very, what I seriously appreciate, the rural rapid transit system around Delhi and the NCR, which will increase traffic commuter by rail rather than by road and by personal vehicles in a 90 to 100 kilometers around Delhi. Similar systems need to be worked out across all major cities and metros. However, India is still enamored by these ideas of what it means to be developed. We think it means to be developed to have a car. Where we had one car, we want two cars. Where we had a scooter, we want a car. Where we had a bicycle, we want a scooter. We also think it means being developed to fly around. And the government has introduced the scheme called UDAN, with this very glorious kind of name that it has, Ude Desh Ka Aam Nagarik. And the political slogan behind this was, Hawai chappal pehnne walon ko hum hawai jahaz se le jayenge. But we all know that an individual passenger traveling by air would consume 10 to 15 times as much in terms of energy and be responsible for that many times of emissions as if he traveled by rail, and which would itself be 5 times as much as if he traveled by less than what he would travel by road, which is itself more if he traveled in a personal vehicle rather than in a public vehicle. So why are we encouraging regional air traffic? We have got in India, around Delhi, these regional rail transport. At the same time, you are promoting small regional airports within 40 minutes flight from Delhi, which you can reach in a 50-minute drive by car or a 45-minute ride by train. So why do you need to introduce the air flight at all? So you need an integrated transport policy, something which will say, if there is a distance of less than 500 kilometers, we will not have air travel between these two places. We will only have medium speed train and buses. So we need that as well. Of course, then there are low carbon road construction techniques, new urban planning, etc., about which we can discuss later. Buildings are a major source of energy consumption, especially in air conditioning. Currently in Delhi, for example, total power consumption in peak power time in summer, 50% of the power consumption is in air conditioning alone. Whereas obviously my rural brothers and sisters don't consume that kind of electricity, but we do. And we design our buildings in such a way that we cannot sit or work in them without air conditioning. We build big glass paint towers in Gurgaon, which attracts all the heat and doubles the requirement of air conditioning. Germany reduced its emissions inside buildings. They, of course, do it by heating. Each house has little heaters in their basement, which circulate steam around the house and warm it up. By making those more efficient and by introducing a glass panel on the sun side, introducing sunlight into the house or office building, raising the temperature inside and therefore reducing the demand for heating, they have reduced domestic energy requirements by close to 17%. In India, we are going in the opposite direction and pushing air conditioners and buildings that require air conditioning. So we need revised building codes. Right now, our building codes are only for large commercial buildings, not for flat owners, etc. Drastic cut in AC loads. We need to reduce the carbon lock-in in housing stock. All these will enable more with green urban commons and improved urban design, will give you great co-benefits in equity by improving energy access for the common person. It will also promote jobs and promote public health. Similarly, in municipal waste, we all know the condition of solid waste in Delhi, in Bombay, where these solid waste dumps regularly, landfills catch fire. It releases methane, which is the fastest growing, among the fastest growing greenhouse gases sources in India. If we had efficient collection, segregation at source and recycling of garbage, it will reduce the burden on the landfills. We could recover the methane from the landfill like you see in the photograph above. These would generate jobs as well as provide substantial co-benefits in better local environment, more jobs, as I said, and in public health. In forests and land use, NDC continues this conflation we have in India. We always say forest oblique tree cover. I just want to ensure that we all understand a bunch of trees do not make a forest. A forest produces and provides more ecological and social services than a bunch of trees. The NDC talks about green highways, and the photograph here will show you that it's a long highway with trees on both sides. Now, this is not a forest. A forest provides multiple species which offer different kinds of sequestration, biodiversity, water conservation, feeding of aquifers, plus 300 million people roughly in India live in or near forests and depend on forests for fuel, fodder, non-timber forest produce, medicinal plants, etc. At the same time, we are invading the forests by deregulation. The revised EIA notification 2020 also promotes this, and violation of forests by mining, by industry and infrastructure projects. This cannot be replaced by tree plantations, which do not provide the same ecological services, even if they may provide most of the sequestration that you look for. Therefore, this is a classic case of where you should be looking at multiple benefits. And here, forests will give huge co-benefits in equity by catering to these 300 million, mostly poor, rural and tribal people, as well as massive benefits for the environment, water conservation, biodiversity conservation, etc. Agriculture for a long time has been considered a no-touch subject in mitigation because you don't want to burden the farmers with more responsibility. But there are sufficient indications to show that farmers are also burdened by increased input costs due to nitrogenous fertilizers, which are expensive, but which have pushed up the disruption in the nitrogen cycle. Both methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions are very high, especially in paddy growing areas, for which alternative methods are available. we have done extremely little work in India on changing of agricultural patterns, which again with a multiple benefits approach should improve soil health, reduce input costs, provide greater climate resilience because we know agriculture is going to be severely impacted, and maybe also promote farm incomes in this process. Lastly, let me say a few words about adaptation, which, as I said, has been completely neglected. Adaptation is not merely how we adjust to climate impacts that have already happened. Ho gaya, now let me see how I can cope with it. So in Mumbai, there are floods when it rains now. So is it that now every house, apart from having a car or a motorcycle, will also have a boat? Because when it rains, let us take my boat out and go. Is that adaptation that we want to follow? So I think we should very seriously work on adaptation. There is no money in this. Government has not allocated any money. Last year, after the floods in Mumbai, there was a big announcement made that government has announced 450 crores for adaptation in cities. 450 crores, you cannot even pay for adaptation and new sewage lines or drain lines in one suburb of Bombay. Forget about the rest of the country. This is nothing at all. This is going to need major investment because frankly, we have screwed up our cities. All the drainage lines are blocked by construction. You can see what's happened in Hyderabad yesterday. The lakes are overflowing. The water has nowhere to go. We don't have water bodies. In cities, drainage lines are blocked. The state action plans, before I come to that, there is also the huge problem of sea level rise. Now, if you can see the map on top, it shows you major urban areas susceptible to sea level rise. You can see the entire region around Calcutta, the entire region around Bombay, the region around Kochi, and on the east coast in Odisha as well. A large number of our major cities are on the coasts, threatened with inundation if sea level rises by 1 meter, 2 meters as predicted. And remember, the longer we take to plan for this, the more it will cost. The floods in Hyderabad and Mumbai are already expected to cost hundreds of crores. And if this keeps happening repeatedly, look at the amount of loss we are incurring instead of spending now in order to save expenditure down the line. Many countries around the world have taken measures, of which I've just shown 2 photographs below, of building barriers to the sea, natural barriers which can absorb the water and protect the urban areas before it. There are many such problems which we can discuss later. So I'll finish my presentation here with this brief illustration of these 2 projections. Of the photograph on the left shows you what is likely to happen to the gateway of India in Bombay if temperature rises by 2 degrees Celsius. And you can see the gateway is half submerged. And the photograph on the right shows you at 4 degrees Celsius, the entire promenade in front of the gateway has disappeared and the gateway itself is virtually buried. So you can imagine what's happening to the city behind it. And India, unfortunately, is like Nero, fiddling while Rome burns. I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I invite you to visit our Delhi Science Forum website, where frequently we upload many articles on contemporary developments regarding climate change or the environment. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Amazing lecture and very insightful. In fact, you left us with a very scary picture, 2 pictures. And I mean, if this is the business as usual continues, the things are not very cozy and comfortable, and it should be an eye opener to all the policymakers immediately on an urgent basis. So we are very thankful, sir, that you have been able to present your thoughts so clearly, and there are some questions that
Sure.
that are there. So, for example, when you talk about the carbon emissions trading, I've been personally studying about this carbon emissions trading for some time by the industrialized countries with the low income countries. However, I feel that this is quite misleading. It is now purported as emissions, these are purported as emissions saving projects around the world and as a major source of environmentally sustainable development in the emerging countries. However, do you think that it is some sort of a neoliberal strategy of exploitation, or is it otherwise?
Yeah.
What are your perspectives on
Yeah.
this?
Firstly, I was not talking about international carbon trading at all. I was talking about domestic carbon trading, which is very different. On the international carbon trading front, I completely agree with you that it is a way by which developed countries pass off their responsibilities to developing countries, where it will cost less and they can pass on the responsibility to you. And definitely it's an extension of neoliberal policies. We must also note that international carbon trading cannot work unless there is an international ceiling. You see, a carbon trading scheme works when there is a ceiling. You set a ceiling and say emissions cannot go above this. Within that ceiling, then those who are consuming more will share with those who consume less, so that things are brought below the ceiling. If you don't have a ceiling, like we don't have under the Paris Agreement, then no carbon trading scheme will work, because why should I sell my shares? So the European Union, for example, has a very effective carbon trading mechanism inside the European Union. It's not international, but it's inside the Union. So ceilings are set in aviation, in industry, etc. And each sector has a target. That target must be met. So those who are above that target sell that quota. Those who are below the target can buy that quota and utilize it, so that the target is met. In fact, it is because of this internal trading scheme that the European Union has been able to maintain its reduction in aviation emissions. They have a very high aviation emissions tax inside the European Union, linked with an integrated transport policy which says no airports less than 450 kilometers between. So all these go together to form a package in which the European aviation trading, emission trading scheme works. Similarly, in India, we have the PACT scheme for large industries. A ceiling has been set, so steel companies trade with each other, cement companies can trade with each other. This is an effective mechanism, and we can introduce similar schemes. Right now, these are focusing on what are called the large emitting industries, because the theory is if you just target, let's say, the top 100 companies in India who are steel, cement, aluminum manufacturers, and they trade with each other and bring emissions down, then it will help. But if we can also similarly extend this to other areas like aviation, like transport, etc., then you will see that there is a cost to aviation, which aviation has to bear. And if airfares go up, then the number of passengers will come down. So this can be made to work effectively in many ways within domestic constraints, because a ceiling can be imposed. Right now in the global market, there is no ceiling, which is why no global carbon trading system can work.
Good. Thank you, sir. So you also mentioned that there can be no social justice without environmental justice in the initial slides you mentioned, and very correctly. And you also mentioned that the Paris Agreement is deeply flawed, and we pursued it on the one hand to engage in greater or deepen our strategic partnership with the US. But was India taken aback when the US administration, the Trump administration, walked out of the Paris Agreement? And did it boomerang for India, given that the US walked away for its own hyper-capitalist interests? And what what should be the way forward? Because
Yeah.
India is deeply engaged in this Paris Agreement.
You see, as I was saying right from the beginning, um, I think India made a big mistake by hooking itself to the US bandwagon in the climate negotiations. See, India fell into the US trap of being invited under George Bush at that time to the G8 plus 5 meetings, which were later called the Major Economies Forum, then morphed into the G20. So India felt very big that we were being invited to the big high table of international powers, and we were sitting there. But in order to achieve that, which was the goal, Bush, the US administration, roped us into all kinds of concessions, including on climate. And we, in fact, if you look at the formulations in Paris, which stem from the formulations at Copenhagen, the formulations at Copenhagen closely follow the formulations of precisely these G8 plus 5 meetings. So that's where the US dictated the policy, which was then carried forward into the Copenhagen, the climate summits, and then got implemented. We should have delinked our position on climate, at least from that. Even if you're trying to stitch up a partnership, it should not be so one-sided that India does everything the US wants and US does not do anything that India wants. And we know that on climate, the US has been unreliable. We know this because way back in Rio itself, Al Gore at that time agreed on behalf of the US administration, went back, the Senate refused, Congress refused, and the US withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol. But the US continued to sit in the climate negotiations because they were members of the UN Framework Convention, kept dictating the terms on it to get better and better terms. Then Obama comes and makes a declaration at Copenhagen. All other developed countries were committing to 20% reduction, 20 to 25% reduction in emissions compared to 2005. He made a commitment of what amounted to 3% reduction. So other countries said, okay, at least the US will join, saying, chalo 3% each sahi, tum aa to jao. He agreed. Within 3 years, Trump withdrew. So the point is, the US has been the most unreliable partner as far as climate is concerned. And today the world is proceeding with climate negotiations on the understanding US may be there, may not be there. Let the rest of the world proceed, the US will follow. And I have consistently advocated India should now be taking a much tougher position, both with regard to the US and with regard to the EU. India's position till now has been very defensive. We think if we get tough with the developed countries, they will get tough with us and they will pressure us to concede more. Point is, we have already conceded a lot. Ab isse zyada kya concede karenge? So I think we should not be afraid of that. We should put pressure. And I think we have the capacity to respond. Like I said, even if tomorrow we have to give a more deeper commitment, there is scope for that in our emissions profile.
Sure. Thank you, sir. Thank you for those points of optimism from the Indian point of view. So very recently, the UN Secretary General was critical of the government of India's plans to subsidize coal.
Yeah.
So is India's continued usage of conventional fossil fuel-based pathways to development jeopardizing its growth prospects? But in the short run, you see that it is actually yielding economic benefits. After all, taking care of the livelihoods of the people are important. So the question remains as to how and when do we understand that there is a need to transcend from the low carbon pathway to the low carbon pathway from the conventional pathways. Yeah. Do you think that India is ready for such a phasing out given its present economic scenario translating into enormous poverty? Yeah. Thank you.
Everyone was skeptical of solar in India when under Dr. Manmohan Singh, a target of 20,000 megawatts was promised. And under the Modi government, when 100,000 megawatts was spoken of. But solar prices have dropped. Solar power generation installed capacity in India has gone up. I think there is further potential for it to go up. However, I think the UN Secretary General was misplaced in his understanding. He's applying a European standard of reducing dependence on coal to India, which is not possible because Europe has high nuclear power. Europe has gas, mostly which it receives from Russia. And Europe still has a high amount of coal. You'd be surprised that the greenest economy, so-called the green champion of Europe, Germany, also has a very high percentage of coal power plants used. However, I think India can take much more proactive measures. Our rate of retirement of old coal plants can be higher. This needs to be done. This can be supplemented by solar power. And also, if we improve our demand management system, like I was mentioning about air conditioners and so on, if we seriously want, we can reduce our dependence on coal. We may not come down to less than 40% the way the UN Secretary General wanted, but we can certainly reduce it from where we are now. The problem with where we are now is we virtually are making a virtue out of coal and saying, let's go have coal. But don't forget, the more we push coal, the more you are pushing for opening up of forests to coal mining, because all the coal deposits are inside forests. So on the one hand, environmentalists cry about destruction of forests. The same environmentalists cannot turn around and say, no, but India needs coal and do this. So if we want to do this, as I said, everything has multiple effects. We need to address this issue. We need to phase out coal. It will not be as rapid as the Europeans want, which the experience of China has shown as well. But once a significant amount of industrial growth has been achieved, our plans should be so that we can increase our solar power generation capacity. But this will also depend on the extent to which, you see, import of solar should not replace import of petrol. We are trying to reduce petrol consumption because we want to be a low import economy. But our entire solar plan is based on import of solar panels. So the more we promote domestic solar industry and make it competitive with imports, including if necessary through suitable tariffs and subsidy arrangements, I think that's the route in which to go, and we can wean ourselves away from coal. The problem is India has no other resource. We don't have hydro. We have saturated our hydro potential. We don't want to do nuclear because nobody wants a nuclear power plant in his backyard. Everywhere you want to put a nuclear power plant, the locals protest. So there's no nuclear possibility. We don't want fossil fuel based oil or natural gas power plant. So what else are you going to do? So coal has to be substituted by solar, and we need to take measures in order to make that happen.
Right, rightly so, sir. So, sir, you have mentioned quite a bit about solar power as a very good source of renewable energy, and it has massive benefits in terms of energy production, rural electrification, etc. So, but sir, if we delve a little deeper, we see that the lifespan of these solar panels, of the photovoltaic modules, it is typically around 20 years or 20 to 25 years. And on the other hand, India does not have a solar waste policy. So in the coming next 2 decades, we are going to see a huge pile of solar waste, and that is going to be detrimental, in fact, to the country's sustainable development goals. What do you think should be the appropriate, in fact, the governments have already begun talking about a solar waste policy, but we are still in the discussion phase. Yeah. So what is actually required? What are the key points that is needed that will be sustainable in the long term?
Yeah, we definitely need a solar policy. Also, Solar panel technologies are changing quite rapidly. Life cycles of solar plants are increasing. Also, there are thin film technologies, so the amount of waste generated is also less. But certainly, every technology brings with it its own problems, which have to be dealt with as you go along. Uh, our cellular phones, which we are all used to now, also generate e-waste, but none of us are saying let us go back to landlines because of that. We have to figure out a way of how do we dispose, how do we recycle, how do we reduce. So we need to do that in solar as well.
Correct. Thank you, sir. When you talk about agriculture,
Yeah,
we know that agriculture is one of the key sectors which is the highest emission producing sectors. So you have also rightly pointed out that farmers are forced, in fact compelled, to use nitrogen based fertilizers, which has great impact, negative environmental impact, and then leads to further negative, I mean, high greenhouse gas emissions. What, in your perspective, is the best way forward to have a climate smart agriculture?
Yeah, I don't like the term climate smart agriculture. Let me say a climate resilient
Sure.
agriculture.
Sure.
See, the argument has been farmers need to use chemical fertilizers in order to promote greater yield. But farmers also know today that yields are dropping because there is a marginal utility in the use of fertilizers, of inorganic fertilizers, because soil health keeps getting reduced. So the productivity per acre is actually less now than it used to be. And if you want to keep the productivity the same, you have to add more fertilizer than you did earlier, which raises your input costs. So there's a variety of options here. One is changing cropping patterns, changing what you grow, where you grow it, putting more emphasis on rain-fed and dryland agriculture than we are doing at present, and promoting more efficient, energy efficient ways. By energy, I mean including fertilizer, etc. There are all kinds of methods available of reducing inorganic fertilizer use, promoting more organic fertilizer use. You may not be able to do away with chemical fertilizer. No chemical, no inorganic slogans may not work. I don't advocate that as an ideology, but definitely we should be making efforts to reduce the amount of inorganic fertilizer that we are using and energy intensive agriculture that we do now. And there are sufficient farmer and farmer group experiments all over the country to show that this is not as unrealistic as some skeptics may believe, that this is quite a feasible option and it is possible.
Sure. Thank you, sir. One last question that I would like to pose to you before I invite Dr. Arjun Kumar to collate the audience's questions is that it is very clear that it is a justice issue when we say that the low income and the small island developing countries are actually facing the brunt of the challenges of a changing climate. There have been scholars and scientists who have really focused on low carbon rural development.
Yeah.
But would this really mean that rural development on the one hand happens with low carbon energy sources, and on the other hand the business as usual continues in the urban spaces? Isn't it going to further skew the development and further indulge in inequality, regional inequality?
Yeah. No, I agree with you, with the exception that you've touched on a subject in which I personally and practically have worked for the last almost 4 decades. In fact, professionally, that's my main job, which is rural industrialization. And now is increasingly important, which is green rural industrialization. Now that means a variety of things. We are talking about low energy production systems which consume less energy, production and distribution sessions systems which consume less energy, reducing length of supply chains. I'll give you a simple example. There is a popular brand of orange juice available in the market. And if you look at the label at the back, it says that this orange juice is made from oranges harvested in Florida in the US. The juice is extracted from there, converted to powder. The powder is shipped to Bombay. It comes from Bombay and goes overland or by air to Nepal, where there is a factory. It gets converted into juice by adding water, etc., and is marketed in India. This makes no sense. And it works because there is an invisible subsidy involved in transportation and in petroleum. Because of that, transport costs appear cheap. But if you build in the environmental costs, especially of climate change, the costs are very high. So therefore, there is greater emphasis today on reducing the length of supply chains, having local production and distribution systems. Today, environmentalists in Europe or the US go to restaurants and demand food which is made using produce within a 30-kilometer radius. That we don't want food coming from Malaysia and from Indonesia and from Japan. We want food which is grown here. So this is the kind of framework for production and distribution systems that we can and should be thinking about. But that's a separate discussion. I think you should invite me again for another talk, and
absolutely.
we can have
I was
a
just about to
full-length
say I had
discussion
this
on
at the
this.
back of my mind. Yeah. Sure. I was just thinking while you were speaking. Yes, sir. So thank you very much. I now invite Dr. Arjun to come up and ask questions to sir. Quick questions, if you can. Yeah. Over to you, Arjun.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. D. Raghunandan, for coming here and sharing so elaborate presentation. I really congratulate you. I will collect the question which have come up on the chat box, and Tanvi is asking that I would like to ask you if you could suggest some research area in public policy and environmental governance sector. Alakri is asking, apart from the inundation of cities due to sea level rise, what are the impact of SLR in the coastal rural areas of West Bengal, Gujarat and Eastern Seaboard, and how will that impact the domestic migration out of these regions? Secondly, what is the outlook on the international scene if changes in political situation in certain ICs do not come through and countries like China also do not reduce their emission per GDP ratios?
Yeah, good.
Yes,
okay.
And sir, I will also add just two questions that we remain on time. So one is also that how do you see for a low carbon pathway to the for the development and growth, the policy discourse and the public planning should be toward this integrated climate change mitigation and towards sustainable development. Also, so what China has demonstrated in terms of air quality control, which they have really shown in last 3, 4, 5 years, which Indian cities has not, despite having moved. Yes, and also in the solid waste management, despite having success in the household toilets for our Swachh Bharat mission. So, sir, especially for this air quality, what should be done and what should we be learning as a developing country from other countries as a best practices? Yes, thank you.
See, look, if I just look through the chats, there are some questions regarding the research areas in public policy. I think I'll request you to share my email address with Tanvi, and we can have a bilateral discussion rather than spending the time here. The question you posed, Arjun, about policies on air pollution and sewage treatment, solid waste management, these are, actually very well-known technology options and systems which are already being practiced in various countries. So it's not as if India needs to rethink and reinvent the wheel, etc. It's mainly a governance and regulation issue. If we want to do it, we will be able to move in that direction. The question is, do we want to do it? Are we serious about doing it? If we are, There is no shortage of technologies. There is no shortage of methodologies available. Other countries are doing it very effectively, and we can learn a lot from other countries, as well as we have our own experts, I'm sure, who can guide us on this. My friend Alok Rai has asked about the issue of sea level rise in coastal rural areas of West Bengal, Gujarat, and the eastern seaboard. How will that affect domestic migration? And what is the outlook on the international scene if changes in the political situation in certain industrialized countries do not come through? So I'll take these two. One is sea level rise anywhere, eastern seaboard, western seaboard, is going to impact on internal migration, on domestic migration, because people will have no option except to migrate from coastal areas inland, which will be highly disruptive because their whole lifestyle, livelihoods are based on coasts, fishing, etc. And if they move inland, this gets totally disrupted, and they will join the mass of migrant workers in various urban areas with very little to show for it. In fact, I'd like to share that I once made a presentation in Guwahati showing a map of Bangladesh and the possible inundation there at different levels of temperature rise. And it showed that at 3 degrees temperature rise in Bangladesh, you would get something like 30 million plus refugees coming out of Bangladesh into India. The next morning, all the newspapers in Guwahati ignored everything else in my presentation, but said, climate expert predicts flood of Bangladesh refugees into India. Because that was a burning issue in Assam those days. But this is a reality. And we are already seeing climate refugees, whether from the drought-stricken areas of the sub-Saharan Africa, from Northern Africa, being driven there. And it is a matter of time before we start seeing internal migration from coastal areas, unless we tackle this. Particularly, the migration from the Sundarbans area is a matter of great concern. Dr. Rai has spoken of Gujarat. I will also add areas of Orissa and Andhra in the coastal belts as well. Tamil Nadu may be able to handle internal migration if it moves inland, but I doubt the same capacity for other states. As far as your question on air pollution is concerned, sewage pollution, sewage domestic waste, as I already said, there are ample models available. Air pollution requires multi-pronged efforts, and it requires to be addressed through multiple methods. I think what we are ignoring many times is, like you see currently in Delhi, the discussion is all about crop burning in Punjab or Haryana. And this becomes the major issue. We forget that the major contribution to air pollution, regardless of winter, summer, inversion, periodic thing, wind speeds, etc., is vehicles. In Delhi, out of 20 million population, we have 11 million personal vehicles on the road today. If we don't reduce this, there is no way we can tackle air pollution in the city. Whatever you can do with regard to stubble burning, etc., etc., you have to tackle this at source. You have to tackle vehicular pollution. That's why I talked about public transport. You have to reduce the number of vehicles on the road by shifting people from personal vehicles to public transport vehicles. Interestingly, by the way, during the lockdown, everybody noticed that air pollution in cities had gone down. And now lockdown has been lifted, pollution has gone up. But it's gone up even more because we have not been able to open up public transport, obviously for safety reasons. But if you don't open up the metros and DTC and the bus services, everybody is using their motorcycles and cars to come on the road. So we have actually got more cars on the road now than we had before. So we know the answers to these issues. There are answers that have been addressed by many countries. You mentioned Beijing, which had the serious problem, which still has a serious problem, but not as much as it had 10 years ago. London comes to mind, which was a very bad case. They moved out polluting industries, they moved out coal-fired power plants, etc. Today, the major problem they are facing is from their double-decker red buses, which still burn diesel and which is causing increased emissions of nitrous oxides and ozone, ground level ozone, etc., etc. So they've got their own emission, but these methods of reducing pollution, air pollution in cities are well known. And if you go to any European city today, you can see the effects staring you in the face. So I think we know what needs to be done. Question is, we are not doing it. I no longer ask the question, who is going to bell the cat? Because it obviously has to be whoever is in government, whether it is city government, central government, state government, I don't care. But governance in India has to wake up to these issues and make a determined move in that direction.
Absolutely. The role of city governments is very, very important in tackling the extreme climatic environmental impacts. Very recently, we have seen how the floods in Hyderabad has almost brought the city to a standstill. Sir, thank you very much. You have covered a wide range of dimensions having implications on sustainable development pathways. And it is actually it is our privilege to have had you for this discussion. And we definitely look forward to having you for further detailed discussion on each of the individual subjects that you have spoken on, and so that we have greater clarity, and then the publications that come out of such discussions would actually inform the policy and the wider network, wider people, people at large. So thank you very much, sir. It was an honor for us to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. So with this, we bring this very interesting discussion to a close. And I thank, on behalf of IMPRI, Team IMPRI, I thank Dr. D. Raghunandan for joining us this evening. And I also extend my warm thanks to India Water Portal, Terry School of Advanced Studies, and for all the audience for being such wonderful audience and people watching us on Facebook Live and on Zoom here. Thank you very much. Have a very good evening.
Good night.
Thank you very much, sir. Good night.
Good night, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.